But why it was such a problem for me was because Satan was using the culture to feed me lies. It's really stressful to live out religion because you can never do it good enough. You're never perfect enough. And it comes to a point where you're worn out and burnt out and tired. Or at least I came to that point.
What's up, fam? Welcome back to Big Picture Podcast, where we discuss faith, testimonies, and perspective while focusing on the big picture. I am your host, Susan, and in today's episode, I am joined by one of my good friends, Olive. So I'm really excited to get into this and hear a little bit about her story. So this is Big Picture Podcast, and I post every other Wednesday. So for today's episode, I'm going to be talking with Olive a little bit about her story, about her upbringing in the German Baptist culture, and then recently leaving German Baptist culture. So backstory, I met Olive about a couple years ago, and I volunteer for a refugee ministry. So every Christmas we go Christmas caroling, and we always invite the German Baptists to come with us. So 2021 was my first time volunteering for that ministry. The other volunteers were telling me, hey, German Baptists are going to come with us. They all know how to sing. And I was like, all right, cool. I don't know what a German Baptist is. When they first showed up, I immediately knew, I think these are the German Baptists. So the women stood out a little bit. So the women had long dresses down to the ankles, kind of like a cape covering over the dress, and then a white cap. So a little bit similar to Amish, but not completely Amish. So anyways, I saw Olive and her two sisters and kind of started thinking like, hey, they're around my age. I want to go talk to them and meet them. And it was just a really good conversation. I just remember thinking that there was something different about them, and their spirits were very genuine, and I just really enjoyed talking with them. So I'm really happy to have Olive here on the podcast. So thank you for being here.
Hey, I'm so excited about having this conversation with you. And I remember meeting you for the first time there at the caroling, and I remember being like, whoa, I love this girl. And like, I want to like keep on having conversations with you. And what really stood out to me about you was just your passion for serving in God's kingdom and how you were displaying God's image through you. And that just really stood out to me, and it blessed me.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think that was definitely just such a fun night and really great getting to meet you. So yeah, I'm excited for this conversation because we have not fully sat down and talked about this.
That's right.
Talked about your story and you leaving German Baptist. So we did live together last summer.
Yes, we did.
For like 3 or 4 weeks. And that was a lot of fun. So yeah, let's just get into the conversation. So tell the people a little bit about who you are.
Well, a little bit about me. I love living life and just enjoying being a human on earth and everything that comes along with that. I love art and traveling and learning new things. But most importantly, I love connection with God and people and those relationships. And I thrive most in those relationships whenever I can have deep, meaningful times with them, as well as carefree, like no pressure times. And I think that those relationships are what makes living life worth it.
Yeah, and that's something that I noticed about you too, that you love experiences and traveling, and you lived in Nigeria.
I did for a few months.
Yeah.
It was a really good experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you do a lot of traveling just within the United States too. And you were born in Ohio.
I was born in Ohio, and then we ended up moving to Indiana and Michigan, and then back to Ohio in 2009 whenever I was about 10. So I got to experience a lot of different things through that, as well as like different parts of the German Baptist community. Yeah, we'll be talking a little bit about that.
Yeah, and you come from a big family.
I do. There were 8 of us children, and now I have a brother-in-law and a sister-in-law and a little niece, and I just really enjoyed growing up in a big family. It was a lot of fun. And we also like lived out in the country all of my life, and we had animals and pets, and I really enjoyed just being out in nature and living on a farm. It's amazing.
Yeah, so I was born in Atlanta, so in the city.
Yeah.
So I remember coming to your place last year, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. Like, you literally live on a farm, and you used to work for...
Yeah, I used to work for the farm. I don't at the moment. But yeah.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So, talk a little bit about your upbringing. So, you grew up as a German Baptist. What does that mean?
So a German Baptist is basically somebody who is a member of the German Baptist Church. And there's quite a few different German Baptist churches, but I was part of the Old German Baptist Brethren and then later joined the Old German Baptist Brethren New Conference, and a little bit more of a liberal form of German Baptist. Mm-hmm. And the German Baptists are a group of conservative Christians that are living out biblical teachings in a cultural way. And growing up in that, it was hard to distinguish between like what are just biblical teachings and what is culture.
Okay, so what are some of the things that represent the culture, like the clothing or the doings?
Yeah. So one of their biggest beliefs that would separate them is their statement of like, we want to be separate from the world. And that comes through in a lot of different ways. It comes through in the way they dress. All of the women wear a uniform, dresses with capes covering their chest and their back, as well as like some of them wear aprons. So it would just be an extra cloth on their dress. And then the guys aren't allowed to have mustaches. And the guys are actually not allowed to wear a tie.
Okay.
And they all wear the same style of suit every single Sunday and with a white shirt. Sometimes they change up the shirt colors. If you're a little bit more liberal, you'll do that.
Okay.
And then a lot of them would have just limited entertainment, and that would be in their belief system of like being separate from the world. And generally, like you wouldn't have a TV in your house, but some of them do. And you wouldn't like work in the entertainment industry at all.
Okay.
So like in music or movies or any of that, you wouldn't like get a job in that.
So where does that come from? Who started the German Baptist culture?
Alexander Mack started it in 1708, I think. And there was a group of believers, and they were like, hey, we want to be baptized as adult believers instead of just relying on infant baptism. And so they got together, and they were all baptized together. And then they started the German Baptist Church. And one of their biggest things was wanting to follow the biblical teachings literally.
So is that where they would say that the no ties comes from, or the no mustaches, or the white shirts? Where does that come from?
That all kind of just developed over time. From what I understand, they just wanted to dress like the common people. And then as the styles started to change, they were like, we don't have to follow every fashion style that's out there. So they just kept their uniform or kept their dress. And then that just became the uniform. So like, for an example, the men had capes on their coats for the longest time because it was kind of a protection from the weather because they were still riding horses outside. They needed that extra layer of protective clothing on them. But then after like people started driving cars and they weren't outside riding horses in the weather, they just kept that cape on their coats for the longest time just because they didn't want to change. And then eventually like it kind of changed.
Okay, so set the scene for us. You grew up in the German Baptist culture, watching the guys dress like this and not have mustaches and wearing the white shirts, and then the women wearing the dresses, because the women also have a specific way they dress with the long dresses and then the cap. So growing up in this culture, this was normal to you.
Yeah, it was very normal. Like I didn't know any different. There was I knew that the world did things differently, but like we weren't supposed to be part of the world. So like we were different, and that was okay because we were living out Christianity in the best way, because that's what I was taught. That's what I was raised in. Even some of the Christians we were with outside of the German Baptist Church believed similar things. So we like spent some time with Amish and Mennonites and ex-Amish and people like that. And they would believe some of this very similar things to us. And so I didn't know much different. It was kind of a way of life, and I was kind of taught that it was the best way to live out Christianity.
So German Baptists are not all over the country though, right? Because I'm from Atlanta, or grew up in Atlanta, and have never seen or heard of a German Baptist till I moved to Dayton, Ohio.
Well, there are a few German Baptists in Georgia. They're just not in the Atlanta area. There are actually more places than you would think. You just don't hear about them because they're not on the news and you don't know very many personally. There are some in California and Montana and Oregon, Idaho, New Mexico, Kansas, and like I know I'm missing like a lot. There's a lot in Pennsylvania, Indiana, a few in Michigan, and then I think the majority are in Ohio, and then possibly between Pennsylvania and Ohio are where most of them are.
So back to setting the scene, what was that like? What was your experience growing up in the German Baptist culture and watching the world around you do things differently?
So there was a lot of good things as well as negative things that I learned just growing up in the culture. And I've had to sort out, like, okay, what is good, what is bad? Like, what was negative about that? And what was positive? Because, like, I definitely want to keep those positive things that I learned. And one of the things was just living a good life, having a good work ethic, and living for more people than just myself. I think it was one thing that the culture taught me that was really, really good. I also learned that it's okay to live differently than the rest of the people in the world. Like, you can do that and, like, be confident in your beliefs, even if nobody else is doing that. And I really liked learning that, like, being able to be confident in that. I got a lot of knowledge of the Bible and of God's kingdom, and I really appreciate that from the culture. I also learned how important family is and community and being trustworthy and also trusting. All really, really good things that, like, I want to keep, and I don't want to lose those positive things that I learned. One of the things that affected me was just being guided by fear and shame, and as well as just the feeling that I had to perform before I could be accepted by God and by people. And I think a lot of this started whenever I gave my life to God, like afterwards. I came to God and I was like, hey, like, I want to live for you the rest of my life because I know that, like, we're in a spiritual battle. And I was really terrified of evil. I was terrified of hell. And one evening I just gave my life to God. And I was like, God, take it, because I can't fight this on my own. I can't fight evil on my own. And, like, I want to live for you the rest of my life. As soon as I, like, got done praying that, and as I was praying that, he just took away all my fear of evil. And it was just, like, a really incredible experience. I was like, whoa, like, God, you're real. Like, this is insane. And then after that, I was like, hey, like, I'm born again now. Like, I'm a follower of Jesus now. And immediately I was like, okay, now you get baptized. Now you join the church. Now you start wearing a head covering, and you start wearing the uniform, the dress, and you start being a good German Baptist. And it was all of these, like, performance things that I had to keep doing. And I wanted to keep doing them because it was like, this is the best way to live out Christianity. And so, of course, like, I wanted to live for God because I had already felt God. And I wanted to keep living for him. And I thought that that was just, like, what came along with the relationship and the best way to make God happy and get closer to him.
So before you made that decision to be born again and to accept God, before that, you're not expected to do any of the German Baptist traditions. You're not expected to wear the clothing or any of that. But then after you make that decision to accept the Lord and be born again, then you're expected to be baptized and then wear the German Baptist uniform and then live out the culture. Is that correct?
Exactly.
Okay.
There's a few things that you do if you're living in a family that's German Baptist, but as soon as you are baptized and you become a member, that's whenever you start wearing the uniform and taking communion and doing all of the German Baptist things. So that's like getting a cap made for you or a head covering made for you. They use sewing machines, but they're done by hand. The dress pattern, it's not like you can just, like, they come in small and medium and large. It's like they come tailored just for you, and it's hard to find a pattern that fits you. So, like, I got the cap and I got the dress, and I had to start wearing all of these new things. It's really stressful to live out religion because you can never do it good enough. You're never perfect enough. And it comes to a point where you're worn out and burnt out and tired, or at least I came to that point. And I was like, I'm trying to do all the right things. I'm trying to live by the culture. I'm trying to make God happy. And, like, I'm doing all the right things, but people aren't even accepting me in that. And I didn't feel like God was accepting me in that. And I was just tired. And so I just kind of gave up. I think I was around like, I don't know, 16 or 17. I was just like, I'm tired of forcing myself to read the Bible. I'm tired of forcing myself to pray and do all of these like religious acts. I'm tired of dressing like the German Baptists. I'm tired of wearing the cap style head covering. And I told God, I was just like, I want my connection and my relationship with you to be real and to be thriving. I'm going to stop trying because I know that like I'm not good enough. What I'm doing will never measure up to a perfect God. And so I stopped reading my Bible. I stopped praying. I would still talk to God, but I stopped like sitting down and like having 10 minutes or 15 or 30 minutes of prayer. Instead, I would just have conversations with God like throughout the day and tell him about what I was feeling. Tell him about like how I wanted relationship and connection with him. But I was like, religion isn't getting me to it. And so like, you're going to have to come to me. And like, this is relationship's going to have to happen because I can't force it. I've already tried.
Yeah. So there's something that you mentioned that I wanted to ask you about again. You talked about how in the culture of German Baptists there was a lot of performance and feeling like you had to perform for people or make people happy. Can you talk a little bit deeper about that? Like, what is an example of that? Why did you feel like you had to make people happy in the culture?
Mm-hmm. One example of that would be there was a lot of emphasis put on looking good on the outside. So as long as you were wearing the uniform right and consistently, looking like you were doing well on the outside, then people would accept you. And you weren't shamed by the culture if you were doing all of the right things. So in the uniform, wearing the cap and the dress, like if you didn't do that all of the time, people would be offended by that. Because one of the biggest things is like, you chose into this. You chose to be a German Baptist. And so if you're not following the German Baptist guidelines, then like people are offended by that.
What does offense look like? How do you know they're offended?
Okay, so for an example, one day somebody came to my house and I was dressed in a long skirt and shirt and did not have the dress on. I did not have the cap on. I think I had a headband on with my hair down in a braid or something. And this person came and they were very cold. Like normally they're cheerful and bubbly, and they were just like cold and to the point. And they took what they needed and they start heading to the vehicle. And my mom comes to the door and she's like, hi. And this other person like didn't even say hi to her and just like walked to the vehicle. And I was like, okay, like I don't know what's going on. I have no idea. And later this person messages my mom and was like, I couldn't even talk to you because like I was so disturbed by how she was dressed. And like I had a long skirt on.
But it wasn't the uniform.
It was not the uniform. And there's just like a lot of cultural pressure to look like everybody else and to be like everybody else in the culture.
I'm just still processing and trying to understand. So would that lady feel justified in her response to be offended that you weren't wearing the uniform?
Yes, they would be justified in being offended because the reasoning behind it would be like, you chose into this. You chose to be a member here at this church. And if you're going to be a member, you better be a part of the community and do everything that the community does. And if you don't like it, like you can go somewhere else. That also gave me a really trapped feeling because it's like, this is all I've ever known. This is my community. But like, I can't live up to every standard and perform for every person because every person does have varying expectations of what being a German Baptist means and how to live in that culture well. And so it's really stressful to be a people pleaser and it's exhausting. Another example was one time I was traveling, and so for me, wearing the head covering was really challenging because if I had to wear it too often, I got a headache. How the cap works, it goes from your ear around your head to your other ear, and then around the back of your neck from ear to ear, and then it ties under your chin. And so it messes with your posture, and it gave me a headache a lot. So I would only wear it if I was going to a GB function GB for short. And I wouldn't wear it other times. And so if people caught me wearing it, not wearing it, like maybe in town if I wasn't wearing the cap, it was always like, oh, I don't want to offend them. So like I would hide if I saw a German Baptist.
Oh my goodness.
Because I didn't want them to be offended by me not wearing the uniform all the time.
So you'd literally hide?
Yes.
You'd literally try to get
I
out
would
of sight.
literally, walk as fast as I could to a different aisle and like get my stuff and get out of that store as fast as possible.
Yeah.
Because I didn't want to feel shame by their rejection. And that controlled a lot of my life. And then one time I was traveling to another German Baptist community and I needed to wear the cap every single day. And I was like, oh no, like what am I going to do? Because I know I'm going to get a headache if I wear it so often. And so I started, like the first couple days, like it didn't bother me. But then I think on the second and third day, I had to start taking ibuprofen for a headache. And I remember just being really frustrated with that and mad about it, because I'm mad about the culture and like, why do we have to live up to these cultural ways of doing things whenever there's more simple ways of living some of these things out.
So you were dealing with not only just the emotions going through of being in that honor shame culture, but also just the physical aspect, literally physical aspect of wearing the cap.
Yeah, it was really challenging. And I also know that some women can wear the cap. They don't get headaches, and they actually love the style. They love how classy it looks and how orderly and dressy it looks. But that was not how I experienced it at all. And I know that there are a lot of people who have experienced it the same way I did and have struggled with it a lot.
Yeah, so thanks for clarifying that and just giving those examples of people pleasing and just highlighting the honor shame culture. So what you were saying before is that you were just wrestling with a lot of things from the age of 10 when you joined the German Baptist culture to the age of 16 or 17 where you felt like you finally had a breakthrough because you had been praying all those years and just having conversations with the Lord of how you felt and just giving that to him. So what did that breakthrough look like?
It looked like giving up and just trying to make God happy and trying to make people happy, and instead just living in relationship with God. And I stopped performing and I started asking God for relationship with him. And so it was a process of like letting God build that trust with me and letting God show me his true character and show me that he doesn't want me to like just follow a list of rules. He wants me to follow his heart and his character. And if I follow his heart and his character, then the rest of like practical living will flow out of that. And it took years of God slowly stripping away like my actions and building a relationship with me. And I remember whenever I started wanting to spend time with him in the morning and actually coming out of spending time with God and being ready to face life again and being revived by that instead of spending time with God and like coming away feeling worn out and exhausted. And so my relationship with God started to thrive. But I was still struggling because I was still in a performance-based culture. And I think it was around the time that I was 18, I just realized that like I wasn't going to be able to stay in this performance-based culture the rest of my life. Like I didn't see a way through. And it wasn't that there was anything wrong with the culture, because it's a perfectly fine culture if you want to choose to live that way and live out biblical teachings that way. But why it was such a problem for me was because Satan was using the culture to feed me lies. And I couldn't quite get away from the lies while still in the culture. And I tried for quite a few years. Like I was 18 whenever I realized that like I was probably going to leave someday. I just didn't know when, and I wanted to have a place to go before I left. But it took me 5 years to actually leave. And a lot of that had to do with generational ties. Just an interesting fact. Like I can trace my family tree like 2 or 3 different ways back to Alexander Mack and his family, who started German Baptist. So like that's a lot of generations of people doing the same thing and teaching their children to do the same thing, generation after generation after generation.
Wow.
And
I
like,
think, sorry, I
go
think
ahead.
that puts that into perspective because, I mean, just if you think about people in the United States that want
Oh,
to
yeah.
trace back their family line, and you can't always completely do that, but you're saying that you're able to do
Yes.
that
Yeah.
all the way back.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
And like the way of living out the culture gets stuck in your DNA. And like you
Yeah.
can't just leave that easily. And I think that that was one of the biggest reasons why it took me 5 years to leave, is because I was like, can I stay? Can I leave? Will I be okay if I leave? Will I survive leaving? Because this is all I've ever known. This is what my parents have known, my grandparents and great grandparents and great great grandparents. And like it's a terrifying thing to step out of that safety zone. One thing that I was taught just growing up by the people around me was if you step outside of the protection of this culture, you won't be spiritually safe anymore. And if you reject this way of living at biblical teachings, and Satan will have the power to deceive you. And if you really believe that, like you're gonna stay in that culture no matter what.
Yeah.
That's a powerful belief system that can control you if you actually believe it. And it was also way more challenging because I was a single girl. And there was a lot of shame in an unmarried girl leaving. Like if you got married outside of the culture and you left because you were marrying somebody outside, then it was a more accepted thing. But if you left as an unmarried girl, it was just because you were being rebellious and not wanting to be under authority. And then also just the view of women wasn't always very healthy. One of the things was like Eve was deceived. And so because of that, that means that women are more prone to deception. And that was never taught in literal words, but that was a belief system that I formed because of growing up in the German Baptist culture.
Okay, so you just said a lot, and wow, I'm thinking of two things. One, I'm going to ask you both of them at the same time. So one, go back to just that teaching of, yeah, if you step outside the German Baptist culture, Satan's going to be able to deceive you. And then you talked also about generational ties and how that goes all the way back to your ancestors. So basically saying that those were two things, like big things that were in your head that made it harder for you to leave. So one, can you give an analogy for people to understand a little bit more about what it would be like to leave German Baptist culture, and then after that talk about how marriage is seen in German Baptist culture, because it's kind of an important, I mean, marriage is an important thing, but talk about it from a German Baptist perspective.
Sure. So an analogy would be, I felt like German Baptist culture and the way of life was kind of like a greenhouse, and we were all plants and trees in that greenhouse. And if you grow within the greenhouse, you're safe and you're protected from the weather outside, from storms. Staying in that greenhouse provides a lot of protection and just safety and security. But if you're growing and you're pushing up against the sides of that greenhouse, or you're growing in a different way than all the uniformed plants that are in that greenhouse, and you grow outside of that greenhouse, or you get transplanted to the outside world, then you're automatically exposed to every storm that comes along. And you kind of have to stand on your own 2 feet. You have to form your own belief system instead of just relying on the belief system that has already been formed for you. And you have to start thinking on your own instead of just accepting what's been handed. And
you have to start thinking on your own?
Yes, you do. Instead of just accepting what's been told. I'm not saying that the German Baptists don't think on their own, because they do. But there's also a lot of security in like, oh, if I just follow this formula,
yeah, that makes sense,
then I'm protected, and I don't have to ask God, like, how do I practically live out modesty? Or how do I practically live out, living in this world, but like serving God's kingdom? How do I practically do that? In the German Baptist culture, you just follow the formula that's already been set up and you're good to go. Like, I had one person tell me one time, they're like, I would never want to leave because it's too terrifying to hear God's voice and listen to what he's trying to tell me, because I'll probably hear it wrong. And it's so much easier to follow this formula, to follow this way of life, because I know it's safe. I know it's a guarantee.
What would German Baptists say about being led by the Holy Spirit? All right, that was part 1 of such an amazing episode. So part 2 will be out in 2 weeks. So make sure you're following Big Picture Podcast on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, on Amazon, on all the listening apps, so you can be the first to know when new episodes are out. I post every other Wednesday. Also, make sure you're following the Instagram page. Shout out to those of you who are following the Instagram page. I am actually doing a free giveaway, 3 free giveaways for one person who's following Big Picture Podcast on Instagram, one person who leaves a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, and one person who reposts Big Picture Podcast content on their Instagram story. So if you're not following the Instagram page, make sure that you do that. If you have not left a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, make sure you do that. And if you have not reposted Big Picture Podcast content on your Instagram story, make sure you do that. So I'm doing 3 free giveaways, and I will announce the 3 winners for that on December 13th. Speaking of December 13th, that will be the last episode for this year. So that will be the day of the last episode for this year for Big Picture Podcast. Then I will take a 2-week break for the holidays, a short break, and then we will kick off on January 3rd with a series. So the first series of the podcast, and I am really looking forward to those conversations. It's going to be so good. So make sure that you're following the podcast and that you're sharing with other people so they do not miss out on the Big Picture Podcast conversations. I also have a really exciting announcement that I will announce in January. So make sure that you are listening and ready for January 3rd when we start back in 2024. All right. Thank y'all for listening to today's episode, and see y'all in the next episode.